The endless void of space was silent, broken only by the soft hum of the engines inside Commander Darren Cole's sleek starfighter. He was on routine patrol near the outer rim of the Sol Defense Network, watching over the trade routes. It was supposed to be a quiet shift. Then, his cockpit screen flickered. A distress signal. Darren frowned. He tapped the console, bringing up the source of the transmission. The signal was weak, garbled, and unlike anything human ships used. The coordinates placed it outside of human-controlled space. An alien vessel, he muttered. A quick scan showed no responding ships nearby. Whoever had sent the distress signal was alone and in trouble. Darren hesitated. Protocol required him to report it to command first, but he knew that by the time the bureaucrats decided what to do, it might be too late for whoever was out there. "Guess I'm checking this out myself," he said. With a flick of switches, he powered up his warp engines and set a course for the signal. Moments later, Darren dropped out of warp space and found himself in a dangerous scene. A large alien vessel was floating lifelessly in space, damaged and barely functional. Deep scars lined its metallic hull, and its engines flickered weakly. "This thing's been in a battle," Darren observed. His scanners detected life signs on board, but they were faint. Whoever was inside was dying. Before he could act, his ship's alarms blared. "Warning. Asteroid field detected." Darren's heart pounded as he looked at the approaching danger. A massive asteroid storm was moving toward the disabled vessel. If he didn't act fast, the ship and its crew would be crushed into space dust. Without thinking twice, Darren activated his thrusters and dove into the storm. His ship weaved between massive chunks of rock, dodging left and right. His reflexes were sharp, his focus unshakable. The alien ship was completely defenseless. It wouldn't survive unless he moved it out of the storm's path. He opened a communication channel and spoke in Universal Standard, the common galactic language. "This is Commander Darren Cole of Earth's Defense Fleet. I receive your distress signal. If anyone is alive, respond now." For a few tense seconds, there was silence. Then, a weak, static-filled voice answered. "Earth, human, help us, please." The voice was desperate. Darren didn't waste time. He pushed his engines to full power and moved to dock with the alien vessel. As he locked onto the airlock, one thought raced through his mind. Who were they, and who had attacked them? Darren took a deep breath as he activated the docking sequence. His ship connected with the alien vessel, sealing the airlock with a heavy clunk. The emergency lights inside his cockpit flashed red. The ship was losing oxygen fast. He grabbed his helmet, secured his oxygen supply, and unlocked the hatch. As the door slid open, cold air rushed past him, and he stepped into the dimly lit corridor of the alien ship. The place was in bad shape. Walls were scorched, wires hung loose, and the emergency lights flickered weakly. The air smelled of burnt metal and smoke. Darren moved carefully, his boots making soft thuds against the floor. He reached for his wrist scanner, tracking the weak life signs deeper inside. Then he heard it, a soft groan. He rushed forward and found them. A group of alien crew members lay on the floor, barely conscious. Their purple-hued skin and elongated features marked them as Kyverians, a species known for their intelligence, but rarely seen near human territories. One of them, a female in a torn uniform, looked up at him. Her eyes, bright silver, were filled with exhaustion and fear. "You are human," she whispered. "Yes," Darren said. "I got your distress signal. I'm here to help." She struggled to sit up, coughing weakly. "We were attacked. Our engines are failing. We need..." She winced in pain. Darren knelt beside her, quickly checking her pulse. Weak, but alive. "How many survivors?" he asked. She motioned toward the others. 5 crew members, all injured. Some had burns, others had deep bruises. Before Darren could respond, his wrist scanner beeped loudly. "Warning. Hostile vessel detected. Incoming enemy ship. His stomach dropped. Whoever had attacked them was coming back. "We have to move," Darren said firmly. "Your ship is dead in space. If we stay, we're sitting ducks." The Xiverian woman shook her head. "We cannot leave our ship." Darren clenched his jaw. Stubborn aliens. His wrist scanner flashed again. The enemy ship was closing in fast. "I don't have time to argue," he said. "If we don't get out of here, you won't have a ship to save." The woman hesitated, then nodded weakly. "Help us." Darren quickly activated his communicator. "I prepped the medbay. I'm bringing injured on board." His ship responded instantly. "Acknowledged, Commander." One by one, he helped the Xiverians to their feet, supporting them as they moved toward the airlock. Just as the last crew member stepped onto his ship, his scanner blared again. Hostile vessel locked on target. Weapons charging. Darren barely had time to shut the hatch before a bright explosion rocked the alien ship. The enemy had arrived. And they weren't here for survivors. Darren barely had time to reach the pilot's seat before his ship's warning alarms blared. Incoming fire detected. Evasive maneuvers recommended. The enemy warship had locked onto them, its plasma cannons glowing bright in the darkness of space. Darren's fingers flew across the controls. Engines at full power, shields up, weapons online. The Xiverian survivors were strapped into the medbay, too weak to help. He was alone in this fight. A plasma bolt streaked past, barely missing his ship. The force of the blast shook the entire hull. "Damn it," Darren muttered. "These guys aren't playing around." The enemy ship was sleek, black, and heavily armed. A Drexen marauder, known for hunting damaged vessels and selling survivors as slaves. Darren's eyes narrowed. Not today. He gripped the controls tightly and pulled into a hard roll, narrowly dodging another blast. The enemy ship fired again. Too fast, too accurate. Darren had only one chance. He had to outfly them. He took the ship into a sudden dive, heading straight toward the debris field left behind by the damaged Xiverian vessel. Chunks of metal and rock floated in the void, dangerous obstacles that could destroy any ship that wasn't careful. "Let's see if you can follow me in here." Darren weaved through the debris, dodging broken panels and jagged wreckage with expert precision. The Drexen ship followed, but slower. Their bulkier warship couldn't maneuver as well. Darren grinned. He had the advantage. The Xiverian woman, Captain Vares, stumbled into the cockpit, gripping the doorway for support. "What are you doing?" she gasped, still weak. "Keeping us alive," Darren said, narrowly dodging another floating wreck. She stared at the screen. "You're flying through this like it's nothing." Darren smirked. "Best pilot on Earth, remember?" She didn't respond, but he caught the surprised admiration in her silver eyes. Suddenly, his scanner beeped rapidly. The Drexens had locked on again. "They're charging their cannons," Vares said, panic in her voice. Darren's mind raced. He needed an opening. Then he saw it. A giant, spinning piece of wreckage, a broken Xiverian battlecruiser panel, floating ahead. He timed it perfectly. As the Drexen ship fired, Darren jerked the controls left, barely missing the blast, which struck the wreckage instead. The impact sent the huge metal panel flying, smashing straight into the Drexen ship's front hull. A loud explosion ripped through space. The enemy ship spiraled out of control, its weapons disabled. Darren punched the thrusters and sped out of the debris field, leaving the enemy behind. Vares collapsed into the co-pilot's seat, breathing heavily. You just outflew a Drexen warship." Darren grinned, stretching his hands. "Like I said, best pilot on Earth." But deep down, he knew. The Drexens weren't done yet. Darren's ship shot out of the debris field like a comet, the damaged Drexen warship spinning behind him. For a moment, silence filled the cockpit, just the sound of his own breathing. Then, Vares exhaled sharply, still gripping the side of the co-pilot's seat. "That was impossible," she whispered. Darren smirked. "For most pilots, maybe." But his confidence faded quickly when his scanner beeped again. Another incoming transmission. He tapped the console, and a holographic image flickered to life. A Drexen commander in heavy armor, his reptilian face twisted in a snarl. "Human." The alien growled, his yellow eyes burning with fury. "You have made a grave mistake." Darren crossed his arms. "Yeah. And what mistake is that?" "Interfering with Drexen business." Behind the commander, Darren could see the battle-scarred bridge of the Drexen warship. Sparks flew. Crew members scrambled to repair systems, but they were still operational. "You attacked a ship that sent out a distress call," Darren said coldly. "I don't stand by while people get slaughtered." The Drexen commander let out a low, guttural laugh. "Hygarians are weak. Their ship was already ours. You had no right to interfere." Darren's jaw tightened. Vara stepped forward, her silver eyes burning with defiance. "We were on a diplomatic mission. The Drexens ambushed us without warning." The Drexen commander sneered. "Your kind shouldn't be making alliances. Your leaders should know better than to send a fragile vessel into our territory." Darren's stomach twisted. This wasn't just an attack, it was a warning. The Drexens didn't want peace. They wanted control. "Your little stunt cost me a prize," the commander growled, his voice dripping with malice. "But no matter. Reinforcements are on their way. You cannot outrun us forever." Darren felt his pulse quicken. More enemy ships. He barely survived one. Before he could reply, the transmission cut off, and the Drexen warship powered up its engines again. Varys turned to him, her expression grim. "They won't stop hunting us," she said. "We need to get to a safe harbor." Darren thought fast. His own ship had supplies, but nowhere to hide. "What about your homeworld?" he asked. She shook her head. "We are too far, and if they follow us, they'll destroy any chance of peace." Darren gritted his teeth. He needed a new plan. Then an idea struck him. "There's a human outpost nearby," he said. "A deep space station, off the grid. It's risky, but if we can get there, we might have a fighting chance." Varys hesitated, then nodded. "Then we go." Darren punched the thrusters, just as the Drexen ship fired again. A blast rocked the hull, alarms blaring. They had minutes to escape, or they were dead. Darren gripped the controls tightly, eyes locked on the Drexen warship as it fired another plasma blast. The ship shook violently, alarms blaring. "Shields at 40%. Hold on," Darren shouted, jerking the controls to the right. The ship tilted hard, dodging another blast by inches. Varys clutched the console, breathing heavily. "Your ship is fast, but we can't take too many hits." "I know," Darren said, his mind racing. The human outpost was still minutes away, too far to run without a plan. And the Drexens weren't giving up. Darren's eyes flicked across his instruments, searching for an opening. Then he spotted it. A dense asteroid belt, floating in the void ahead. Dangerous, unpredictable, a death trap for most pilots. But Darren wasn't most pilots. He smirked. Time to show these lizards what a real pilot can do. He pushed the thrusters to max, heading straight for the asteroid field. Varys's eyes widened. "You're flying into that." "Unless you've got a better idea," Darren said. She hesitated, then shook her head. "Just don't get us killed." Darren grinned. "No promises." The asteroid belt loomed ahead, massive chunks of rock drifting in unpredictable patterns. Darren weaved between them with impossible precision, barely scraping past jagged edges. His reflexes were perfect. Behind them, the Drexen warship followed, but it was too big. It had to slow down to navigate. Darren took full advantage. He twisted and turned, using every piece of debris as cover. His ship was smaller, faster, more agile. The Drexens fired, but their shots missed, slamming into asteroids instead. Explosions rocked the belt, sending more debris flying. Darren's pulse pounded, but he was in his element. This was his battlefield. Inside the Drexen warship, the commander's rage boiled over. "Destroy them," he bellowed. His crew scrambled, trying to track Darren's unpredictable movements. But it was too late. Darren spotted a large asteroid floating just above the Drexen ship, a perfect opportunity. He lined up his shot, fingers flying over the weapon's console. With a single, precise blast, he hit the asteroid's weak point. The massive rock broke loose, crashing down onto the Drexen warship's hull. Boom! The enemy ship lurched, thrown off course, engines sputtering. They were stuck in the asteroid field, unable to pursue. Darren let out a breath. That should slow them down. Varus stared at him, stunned. No Xaverian pilot could have pulled that off. Darren smirked. "That's because I'm not Xaverian." She shook her head, half in disbelief, half in admiration. "You humans, you truly are something else." Darren glanced at his scanners. The human outpost was minutes away now. They weren't safe yet, but for the first time, they had a fighting chance. The asteroid field had given them some breathing room, but Darren wasn't fooled. The Drexens wouldn't stop. They were relentless. He glanced at the readouts on his console, scanning for the next move. The human outpost was still a few minutes away, but the Drexens weren't far behind. "Hold on," Darren muttered, his voice tight with concentration. Beside him, Varus remained silent, her eyes scanning the vast darkness of space, clearly deep in thought. "Darren, we can't outrun them forever," she said after a moment. "They'll be back, and we're barely holding together as it is." Darren nodded, his eyes still fixed on the controls. The ship had taken a lot of damage already. The shields were barely functional, and the engines were working at half power. The Drexens had more ships. If they came after them in force, they wouldn't stand a chance. "We need to do more than run," Darren said, tapping a few buttons on his console. "We need to fight back." Varus looked at him, skeptical. "Fight back? With what? This ship is barely operational." He met her gaze, his eyes hard. "We have what we have. We're not backing down." She paused, her silver eyes scanning the cockpit. "I've never met a human like you before." Darren shrugged. "You'll get used to it." Darren set to work immediately. The first priority was getting the ship's weapons back online. The laser cannons were barely functional, but with some quick thinking, he could get them firing again. The missile launcher, however, was beyond repair. That was a setback, but he couldn't afford to waste time dwelling on it. He moved quickly, connecting cables, rerouting power, and using parts from the damaged systems to keep things running. He was no engineer, but he had enough experience to make things work when it counted. As he worked, Varus stepped up behind him. "Your skill with this technology is impressive, but it will only delay the inevitable. The Drexens have numbers. They will overwhelm us." "Maybe," Darren said, not looking up. "But not today." The ship's weapons came back online with a low hum. Darren tested the lasers with a quick burst. They would work, at least for now. "We've got one shot at this," he said, turning to Varus. "We're going to hit them where it hurts." "Where?" she asked, narrowing her eyes. Darren pointed to the scanner. The Drexen fleet was still too far out to get a precise lock, but he had an idea. "There's a small Drexen supply depot not far from here. It's a staging point for their warships. If we destroy it, we'll disrupt their supply line. They won't be able to launch reinforcements." Varus thought for a moment. "That's a bold move. If we fail, we'll be stranded with no way out." "Yeah, but we'll never get another chance." Darren smiled grimly. "If we can take out their supply base, it'll give us the edge we need." The Drexens were closing in again, but Darren held his course. He maneuvered the ship skillfully, avoiding incoming fire as he drew closer to the supply depot. The base was an old fortified station, hiding in the shadow of a nearby moon. It was lightly defended, but heavily stocked, perfect for their plan. As they approached, Darren made sure to keep the ship in a position where he could launch a surprise attack. He was low and fast, barely skimming the surface of the moon. "Ready?" he asked Varys, his fingers on the trigger. She nodded, her face set. "Let's finish this." Darren fired the laser cannons, and the first blast hit the supply depot with a massive explosion. The station shuddered, and sparks flew from the structure as it began to fall apart. More shots followed, pounding the depot until it started to crumble into space. Behind them, the Drexen fleet arrived, but it was too late. The depot was already in flames, and their reinforcements were cut off. Darren punched the controls, putting all his energy into the final stretch. "We've done it," he said. "Now, let's get to the outpost." With the Drexen supply line crippled, they had a small window of time to escape, and Darren wasn't about to waste it. The chase was far from over, but for the first time, they had the upper hand. The Drexen fleet had been thrown off course, at least for now. Darren couldn't afford to relax, though. The explosion at the supply depot had been a major blow, but the Drexens were quick to regroup. He knew their revenge would come fast. His ship raced through space, heading for the human outpost, but Darren's eyes kept darting between the scanners and the view ahead. He didn't trust the Drexens to give up that easily. "We won't make it in time," Varys said, standing beside him, her voice tight with concern. "They'll be on us again before we can even get a full jump on the outpost." Darren's jaw tightened as he pushed the thrusters to maximum, sending the ship screaming through space. He had to buy them more time. "We've got one more trick," he said, his voice grim. "But it's going to be risky." Varys glanced at him, her silver eyes narrowed in suspicion. "What are you thinking?" Darren didn't look at her as he calculated the trajectory. "The Drexens are predictable. They'll chase us, but they're not fast enough to catch us in open space. The only chance they have is to set an ambush." Her eyes widened. "An ambush? Where?" Darren pointed to the asteroid field they had just passed. "We're going back in." "You want to take us back into the asteroid field?" Varys asked, disbelief in her voice. "Yep," Darren said, locking in the coordinates. "We'll use it against them. We know the terrain, they don't. If they're coming, they'll have to go through us." The asteroid field loomed ahead. The asteroids were massive, and some were moving slowly, while others were just floating in place, making the area chaotic and difficult to navigate. But for Darren, this was his element. The Drexens wouldn't know what hit them. He slammed the ship into full reverse, steering toward the field. The ship bucked under the pressure as it slowed down, positioning itself in a narrow passage between two large asteroids. Behind them, the Drexen warships emerged from the darkness, their massive forms cutting through the void. Darren could see their ships charging up their weapons, preparing for another attack. "Now," Darren shouted, his fingers flying across the controls. He punched the thrusters and sent the ship darting into the heart of the asteroid field. The Drexens followed, too eager to catch up, ignoring the dangers of the field. As expected, the Drexens entered the field just behind him, but Darren already had his strategy in place. The Drexen warships weren't built for this kind of chaotic terrain. Their heavy armor and sluggish speed made them easy targets in the narrow gaps between asteroids. Darren steered the ship around a giant rock, using it as cover. He quickly fired a few blasts to get the Drexens' attention. They took the bait, charging forward, thinking they had him cornered. The Drexen warships closed in fast, blinded by their rage and the desire for revenge. Darren grinned, tapping a few more controls. "Now, Varys," he called. She didn't hesitate. With a quick movement, she pressed the button that released the distracting flares. The bright flashes of light reflected off the rocky surfaces, confusing the Drexen's sensors. For a moment, the Drexen's ships lost track of Darren's position. They were caught off guard, drifting off course. Darren seized the opportunity. He drove the ship straight through the gap between two massive asteroids, firing the laser cannons. The first Drexan warship tried to follow, but it was too late. It collided with the asteroids, exploding in a massive fireball. Darren punched the controls again, taking them through the debris. His heart was racing, but there was no time to relax. The second Drexan ship was still coming. He slammed the ship into a hard left, aiming for a large asteroid that hung in the path of the remaining Drexan vessel. The Drexan ship tried to turn, but it was already too close. Boom! The asteroid shattered into millions of pieces as the Drexan warship collided with it, sending debris flying in every direction. Darren exhaled slowly as he watched the wreckage float in the void. "That should take care of them for a while," he said, his voice steady but strained. Varys looked at him with a mix of awe and disbelief. "I still don't understand how you did it." Darren shrugged, focusing on the final push toward the human outpost. "Just knowing how to fly, and having a little luck on our side." But even as he spoke, he knew the danger wasn't over. The Drexans weren't done yet. They'd come back, and when they did, Darren would be ready. The human outpost loomed ahead, its outline becoming clearer against the backdrop of the dark void. Darren's fingers tightened around the controls as he pushed the ship toward it. But even as they neared safety, the nagging feeling in his gut told him the fight wasn't over. The Drexans had been hit hard, but they were still out there, and they would never stop chasing. "Darren," Varys said quietly, her voice tense. "We're almost there, but I don't know if the station can hold them off." "I'm not worried about the station," Darren replied, his voice calm but determined. "I'm worried about us." He punched the thrusters and steered the ship into the docking bay of the outpost. The doors slammed shut behind them, cutting off any immediate threats. For a brief moment, there was silence. Darren let out a slow breath. "We made it," he muttered, glancing over at Varys. She nodded, but her expression was uneasy. "We may have bought ourselves time, but not enough. They'll come for us, and when they do, we'll have to fight." Darren's mind was already racing. The Drexans weren't the type to back down easily, but neither was he. He stood up, scanning the outpost control panel. "We'll need to power up the defenses, and I need to get word to the human fleet." The outpost's defense systems were old, but they would work. Darren activated the energy shields, and the heavy weapons systems came to life with a loud hum. As he worked, Varys moved to the communication station, tapping buttons quickly. "We have to get a message out," Varys said, looking over her shoulder. "The Drexans won't just attack us. They'll wipe out this whole station. We can't let them do that." Darren nodded, making a few more adjustments to the ship. He looked at Varys. "Send the distress signal. We need backup." She didn't hesitate, and within moments, a transmission was sent out to the nearest human fleet. The two of them had done all they could to prepare, but the real test was yet to come. Darren could feel the tension building in the air as they waited for the Drexans to make their move. Moments later, the station's alarms blared again. The Drexan ships had arrived. Darren and Varys rushed to the viewing window, looking out into the blackness of space. 3 Drexan warships were approaching, more than enough to destroy the outpost. "We don't have much time," Darren said, his voice low. "I'll go out and hold them off as long as I can. You stay here, coordinate with the fleet." Varys shook her head. "I'm not staying behind." "I need you here," Darren said, giving her a serious look. "If we don't get backup, we'll need someone to keep the station running. You're the only one who knows how to manage this place." For a long moment, she just stared at him. Then, with a deep breath, she nodded. "Be careful, human." Darren turned to the outpost's hangar, where a small fighter ship sat, ready for launch. It wasn't much, but it was enough to buy them some time. He suited up quickly, pulling on his helmet. As he climbed into the cockpit, he looked back at Varys. She gave him a silent nod, her face set with determination. The fighter launched into the cold expanse of space, Darren gripping the controls with a steady hand. He could see the Drexen ships now, massive and imposing, their weapons glowing brightly in the darkness. He had one chance. He wasn't going to let them take the station, not after everything they'd been through. The Drexens fired as soon as they saw him, but Darren was already darting between their blasts, weaving in and out of their fire. His ship was smaller, faster, and he was a damn good pilot. He locked onto the nearest Drexen ship and fired a barrage of lasers. The ship shuddered, but didn't go down. Darren quickly made another pass, hitting its engines. The ship's shields flared, but it began to slow down, giving him the opening he needed. "Come on," Darren muttered under his breath as he pulled the trigger again. This time, the Drexen warship exploded, pieces of debris scattering into space. Darren didn't celebrate. He couldn't afford to. There were 2 more ships, and they were already turning their guns on him. The battle had only just begun, but Darren was ready, and he wasn't backing down. Darren's heart pounded as he weaved through the incoming fire, the Drexen warships closing in on him from both sides. He was fast, but they were relentless. His small fighter, though nimble, was outnumbered and outgunned. Every move felt like a gamble, every maneuver a calculated risk. The Drexens didn't give him a moment's peace. Their weapons lit up, firing blast after blast as they attempted to corner him. Darren could see them moving into position, their ships closing in on him like a vice. There was no way out. He gritted his teeth, sweat dripping down his forehead as his mind worked quickly. His backup was still a few minutes away, and he couldn't afford to let the Drexens get any closer to the station. He had to buy more time. "Come on," Darren muttered to himself, his fingers flying over the controls. The fighter dipped and dived through the endless black, dodging each shot with expert precision, but he couldn't keep this up forever. He glanced at the readout on his console. The shields were almost gone, and the engine was starting to overheat. His ship was barely holding together, and yet he refused to stop. The first Drexen warship closed in, its massive cannon charging. Darren knew this was it. He had no more time to waste. He locked onto the ship's weak spot, a small gap near its engines, and pushed the thrusters to full power. With a sharp turn, Darren sent his fighter shooting straight toward the Drexen ship, knowing it was a one-way trip if he didn't make the shot. His heart raced as he fired his remaining missiles, sending them straight toward the gap in the enemy's defenses. The missiles struck with pinpoint accuracy, and the Drexen warship exploded, its massive hull breaking apart. Pieces of the ship flew off into the void, and for a brief moment, Darren could breathe again. But he didn't have time to celebrate. The second Drexen warship swung around, its massive cannon charging once again. Darren's pulse quickened as he realized he was running out of options. His ship was falling apart, and the Drexens were just as determined as ever. He couldn't outfight them. He couldn't outfly them. But there was one thing he could do. Darren's fingers danced over the controls, setting a course for the largest asteroid in the field, a massive rock that was blocking the view of the Drexen fleet. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was his last shot. He set the ship on a collision course with the asteroid, knowing he was going to be miles away from safety. If it worked, the Drexens wouldn't be able to follow him. If it didn't, he was going to be lost in space. "Here goes nothing," Darren whispered, slamming the throttle forward. He fired the engines with everything he had, the fighter shooting toward the asteroid at breakneck speed. The Drexens fired, but their shots were off target as they lost track of his position. Darren's fighter flew toward the asteroid with deadly accuracy, dodging incoming fire as he calculated the perfect moment to turn. With seconds to spare, he pulled the ship hard to the left, narrowly avoiding the massive rock and sending the ship into a dangerous spin. The Drexens followed blindly, thinking they had him cornered. But as they dove into the asteroid field, they were lost in the chaos, unable to track him. Darren took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart. He couldn't afford to make another mistake. The Drexens were confused for now, but they'd figure it out. They'd come for him again. But as he pulled away, he caught sight of something. A flash of light in the distance. The backup was here. Darren smiled to himself, his heart filled with relief. He had bought them just enough time. The human fleet had arrived. And now, the Drexens were the ones who were outmatched. Darren's hands gripped the controls as his fighter darted through the asteroid field. The Drexen warships were still behind him, chasing him through the chaos of jagged rocks and debris. The last few minutes had felt like a lifetime, each second bringing him closer to either salvation or destruction. But just as hope seemed like a distant memory, the flash of incoming ships in the distance told him everything he needed to know. The human fleet had arrived. Darren's eyes scanned the screen, seeing a squadron of Earth ships break through the asteroid field, their weapons primed. The Drexens had been completely distracted, still chasing him through the rocks. They were outnumbered now. The tables had finally turned. Darren pushed his fighter into one last evasive maneuver, shooting toward a nearby asteroid to give him some cover. The Drexen ships, still focused on him, didn't notice the human fleet coming in from behind. As the first human ships opened fire, bright energy blasts lit up the space between the two fleets. The Drexens tried to retaliate, but they were slow to respond, thrown off by the surprise attack. The Drexen flagship, which had been leading the chase, took a direct hit from a human warship's cannon, causing a massive explosion that split it in two. Darren watched in awe as Drexen ships began to retreat, their once cocky confidence shattered. The human fleet had come in full force, and the Drexens weren't prepared to face it. The once feared enemy had now become the prey. Darren's chest swelled with relief as the fight began to wind down. The Drexens were in full retreat, drifting out of range as they struggled to regroup. He had done it. He had bought enough time for the human fleet to arrive and finish the job. As the remaining Drexen ships flooded into the depths of space, Darren pulled his fighter into a slow, controlled orbit, watching as the human fleet began to mop up the remaining forces. Varessa's voice came over the comms. "Darren, you did it. You saved us." Darren smiled, feeling the weight of the last few hours lift off his shoulders. "We did it, Varess. You held the fort, and I just bought some time. It's all part of the plan." Varessa's voice softened. "You're more than just a pilot, Darren. You're the reason we're still here. Without you, we wouldn't have made it." Darren glanced at the outpost, now safe under the protection of the human fleet. He couldn't help but feel a sense of pride, not just for himself, but for the humans who had come to their aid when it mattered most. As he touched down on the station, the airlock opened, and he was greeted by human officers who gave him a salute. His reputation as the best pilot on Earth had never been more solidified. He had proven that humans were more than just survivors. They were fighters willing to risk everything to help others. Varess walked up to him, her expression softening as she approached. "I don't think I'll ever understand why you risked everything for us," she said quietly, "but I will never forget it." Darren looked her in the eye and smiled. "Sometimes you do what's right, even if you don't have all the answers." Varess nodded, a small smile forming on her lips. "I'll remember that. And maybe, one day, we'll meet again. As allies." Darren extended his hand. "I'd like that." As the human fleet secured the station and the Drexens retreated into the distance, Darren felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This mission had been more than just a battle for survival. It had been the beginning of something new, a sign that the human race was ready to stand alongside the galaxy's greatest civilizations. The war was over, but this victory was just the start.